So, tonight's topic is teaching the new generation of tech here in New York City. You've already heard just in the last 10 minutes from about 4, 5, 6, 7 different amazing programs going on that are bringing computer science and technology education to students here in New York City. There are many others, and what we want to talk about tonight are the successes, challenges, and opportunities related to this new and growing space here in the city. And I'm going to give you a few sort of lenses to frame that conversation, and then we're going to talk a little bit amongst this esteemed panel, and then we're going to turn it over to you to lead and hold some discussion. So, with all of this change, there's been a lot of change. If you think back to computer science education, I don't know, around when I was born, in the mid-'80s, it was one thing. And we're in the midst of this interesting transformation. Suddenly people are curious about computer science again. They're really interested in it, but they're looking at it with a different lens. And one of the ways in which things are a little different now is there's a great emphasis, thanks especially to someone who's sitting on our panel, there's a great emphasis on the idea of broadening participation, opening up access to computer science to people who before didn't have that opportunity or weren't engaged. So that's one of the lenses. How is computer science itself changing to adapt to these new perceptions? And the other thing I wanted to think about is we want to leave this tonight with some actual concrete ideas. CSNYC is a foundation. It's a bunch of people whose job is to work on these problems. So we want to come away with your ideas and things that we can actually do and try and change here in New York City as we embark on these new adventures. So those are the two guiding thoughts that I want you to think about. This idea of how is computer science itself changing as perceptions are changing, and how are we broadening participation through that? Those are your two general lenses. And we're going to break out into 3 groups, and we're going to have our panel sort of introduce each of those 3 groups before we go into discussions. So for the first category is very much that idea of broadening participation, opening up access, and growing to scale. And we have 2 amazing people who are going to guide that discussion. First one is somebody you've already met, Lyel Resner, who works here as the Director of K-12 Education. Everyone welcome Lyel. He lives here, but thanks, Lyel.
I sleep under this table.
Yes. And the other person is a very special guest who's in from, actually I don't know where you're based at. In from DC, up from DC. This is Jan Cuny. Jan runs essentially computer science education at the National Science Foundation. She's responsible for grants of about $25 million a year to support programs that are bringing computer science to K-12. If you've heard of Exploring Computer Science, who's heard of Exploring Computer Science? Who's heard of Computer Science Principles? Okay, so about the same people. These are amazing new curricula that are coming out or have already come out that are being implemented incredibly widely across the country and are largely the result of work Jan has been doing. So we're really thrilled to have Jan with us. And so I want to let Lyel and Jan frame this first area of discussion around access and scale. Do you want this?
Maybe from back here, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'd like to start maybe by posing a question. So of the educators or who here works in what could be considered to be, say, an underserved community? Wow, that's awesome. How many of you know of maybe a community-based organization in your neighborhood that offers some sort of after-school or summer programming? And how many of those organizations, how many of them, say, do you know, offer, say, a basketball or a sports camp or after-school program?
Only that.
Only that.
That's the most important thing, isn't it?
So I think in framing this conversation, one of we was talking about with my colleagues earlier, and I feel like thinking about how to make the default having CS camps be as ubiquitous as, say, sports camps in accessible, known places in particular communities of need is an interesting frame. So when we think about access, I mean, broadly, we want to think about the question, how do we reach the most number of students from the most diverse range of backgrounds? And within that question, there are some constraints some clear kind of first order constraints. The first, of course, is access to teachers, which everyone in the space struggles with. There's a dearth of technologists in the first place in the industry. It's hard enough to bring industry specialists into a classroom, particularly a public school classroom. There's access to technology. There's geography. There's access to even, say, the difference in access to depth of resources, even when resources are available, say, in school versus after school versus maybe one-off workshops or seminars or volunteers who come in and speak. Thinking about that, again, that essential question, maybe those two essential questions of one, how can you make it as ubiquitous as something like basketball camp? Two, more broadly, how can you reach the most number of students from the most diverse range of backgrounds, underserved and say privileged alike? And then subsequent to that, thinking for the underserved folks in particular, before access, you need awareness. And so how do you go into communities and communicate the growing importance or opportunity that exists in this space? How do you communicate it to folks who frequently will self-select themselves out of participating in specific fields? These are some of the questions, hopefully, that our group will be able to focus on and parse and break open a little bit.
Okay, so I don't, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I don't have a lot to add to that. I started at NSF 10 years ago, and I was hired to broaden participation in computing. NSF defines the underrepresented groups in computing as women, African Americans, Hispanic, Native Americans, and Indigenous people, and persons with disabilities. So if you look at those students, that's 70% of our population. It's actually more if you look at just the student population, but the overall population, 70% of our population. That's huge. And the fact that we don't include them in computer science often is really a tragedy. African American males between the ages of 13 and 17 say they're interested in computer science careers, IT careers, at a higher rate than white and Asian males, but they don't get there. You know, they don't get there because they don't have the access. And so one of the things that I did very early on was I funded a woman named Jane Margolis who was studying, she did a very famous study of women at Carnegie Mellon, but then she moved to LA and studied what was happening in computer science in Los Angeles schools. And she found that, not surprisingly, really wealthy schools had amazing computer science offerings, but most of the schools in LA had nothing. And she was a sociologist, but she was so incensed by this that she dropped her work as a sociologist and started trying to fix what was going on in the schools. And one of the things she did was create this course with a bunch of computer scientists called Exploring Computer Science. And I remember in one of the very early days talking to her about that, and she was in 3 schools. And she was really proud of the work that they had done, and she was talking about this. And I thought, well, how many schools are there in LA? And I forget how many there are, but there's a lot more than 3. And so I said, well, what about all those other schools? And then I kind of paused and said, what about Miami and Chicago and New York and all of these other cities? And it was kind of in that conversation that it dawned on me that it wasn't enough to just run these little projects with NSF's money that did good things where they lived, but really we had to figure out how to change this for the whole country. And so the idea of access and scalability is kind of all built in there. So ECS is now, this summer, there were over 600 teachers trained around the country, and they've been training teachers for several years, so there are many thousands of courses that are being offered in ECS, and lots of students are taking it, but it's still nowhere near in every school. And then we started also in terms of scalability. I couldn't see how you could scale ECS. Turns out it's scaling on its own, but I couldn't see how that would happen in an individual course like that. So we contacted the College Board, got them to create a new AP course that I think is very exciting and will be available in 2017. But again, there are about 500 teachers who are trained in that this summer as well, so it's already being offered. So I think the issues of how we engage students from underrepresented groups and retain them is really closely tied in with the how do we do things so that we can scale them. And then, not a topic for our conversation, but one that's really plaguing me at the moment is, how do we do it so that we can scale it and make it sustainable? So that when the organizations like NSF or Code.org or CSNYC, all these organizations that are really instrumental in getting this to happen now, when those organizations end or change their interests or something, how do we have a thriving college ecosystem, I hate that word, but that supports teachers so that this thing continues on its own? Because if we get it into every school now, and 5 years from now it's died away, that would really be an amazing loss. So those are the things that I worry about and would be happy to talk about.
All right, so that is the first discussion that you can elect to join in a few minutes. That one is access and scale. So the second conversation, how many, just raise your hand, who can name a program, a curriculum, a class, a club, an organization related to computer science that is operating in New York City? Raise your hand if you can name one. We're just going to shout them out.
Hive NYC.
Hive NYC.
Software engineering pilot.
Software engineering pilot program.
Code.org.
Code.org. Girls Who Code.
Black Girls Code.
Black Girls Code. Teals.
All-Star Code.
All-Star Code. Script Ed. There's a lot more of them.
Flatiron School.
Flatiron School. You're sitting in one. Right? There's all kinds of programs. There are so many of them. The second category, the second discussion is called Alphabet Soup. Leading the Alphabet Soup discussion, we have two awesome people. First off, we have Eric Allatta, who's usually doing what I'm doing, moderating, but today we're making him work for his dinner. So Eric is a teacher of computer science at the Academy for Software Engineering. And then we also have Danny here from the Flatiron School. Danny is a K-12, or actually high school educator here at the Flatiron School. So I'll let them introduce that topic. Who wants it?
Hi, so I teach at the Academy for Software Engineering, and that I think right away my interest in this aspect of the conversation comes up. Why don't I teach at the Academy for Computer Science? What are we trying to bring into that that's different than computer science? And at the Academy for Software Engineering, we are a career and technical education high school. So the idea is to prepare students for an actual industry, to get jobs, if not directly at a high school, into a 4-year program that could prepare them for some part of this software industry. We do call all of our classes computer science, though. And we need some way, as a career and technical education high school, we need some way of demonstrating that our students have a skill set. And we need that exam, or that to be vetted by the software engineering industry, again, whatever that is. So we run our students at the Advanced Placement Computer Science exam. That's the biggest externally evaluated exam that we could find. All the other ones just weren't really very good, or they were much too difficult, or much too nuanced or tedious. At the same time, we have these amazing programs that are doing web development. We have people working with Scratch and with younger students that are getting them to just make something, just be excited about the creation that they've done. We try to do something similar where students are doing project-based curriculum, but they have to articulate what they know. We need them to have a conceptual underpinning where they can say this is a Boolean expression, right? They can say what that means. Well, I'm really curious about what the challenges might be around calling all of this, calling all of this technology without having a public understanding of the different nuances and the different goals. I think that we don't all have exactly the same goal. Getting students into a career is not the same goal as just getting students excited so that they can start finding excitement in everything else that they're doing in school, which tends to not be that exciting. So that's where I'm hoping that we can go, is to tease apart all of these different pieces, find out what the overlap is. Like, I'm really interested in finding skills overlap in all of the different programs. And I find that most of those skills are soft skills. It's not exactly a Boolean expression, but it's, can you work together? Can you iterate on a problem? And getting those to the surface. But then also talking about, is it important to have external measurements? Is there a way to say if we're being successful as a group? Because if I think we've seen in other pockets of this, if it's teaching students how to make PowerPoints, That's the rallying cry where we say, no, we're not that. We're not teaching students just how to use Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint. But maybe other people don't know that that's different than what we're talking about. That computation is not just using software. It's different. Getting a computer to follow instructions is not the same as just using software. So that's where I'm hoping that we can go.
Great, I think that pretty much covers it. One other area kind of related to this that really interests me as well is, you've got all these buzzwords. You've got web development and coding and programming and computer science and software engineering. And so on the one hand, kind of for the general public, like how do you differentiate it to the layperson? And how do you get educators who don't know about computer science to really kind of understand those nuances, those basic nuances. Then on the other side is kind of the talent pipeline. How do educators who are interested in this choose one of these topics and go into, say, makerspace or a web development or computer science? So I think they're really interesting questions that we can kind of dive deeper into during our discussions.
Let's do that. All right, so that was the second topic that you can choose to discuss tonight. Alphabet soup, coding, programming, computer science, software engineering, making. What are all these things? How do they interact? Remember, the first one was access and scale. The second was alphabet soup. And if you're looking at these little whiteboards around the room, they actually also have the titles on them, so you don't have to forget. The third and final breakout room you can elect to join tonight, we're calling Better Together or Divide and Conquer. And we have two wonderful people leading that discussion as well. First up is Moria, who is the Executive Director of Script Ed. I'll let her tell you a little bit about that if she wants to tonight. And then we also have Vic from the Flatiron School, another high school instructor here at Flatiron, who wants this first.
Hi everyone, it's really great to see you. I'm very excited that you're all here because I'm really excited to talk about this. So Script Ed is a nonprofit that similar to Teal to recruit volunteers from the tech industry to go into schools, high schools around New York City. Low-income high schools, we say, or underserved high schools, where with schools that only serve 75% or more student population qualifies for free or reduced price lunch. We teach them the fundamentals of web development, and then over the summer we place the students into paid internships at technology companies around the city. So our topic tonight is going to be a little bit about partnerships. There are a lot of organizations in the city that are trying to increase access to computer science, software engineering, whatever you want to call it. We want to increase access to this type of education. And we are posing the question, is it better for us to work together? Is it better for a student, for example, to be in the software engineering pilot, then go to a TEALS class, maybe participate in a Script Ed after school program, go to the Flatiron School over the summer? Or are we better off as a community to divide and conquer? Should we be not necessarily be giving kids this roadmap of opportunities, but trying to get as many students as we possibly can, and how can we then work together to make sure we are hitting as many communities as we possibly can? And I will let Vic continue this.
Yeah, I think Maureen gave a really good summary, and we've had a wonderful opportunity to be able to partner with Script Ed ourselves, and be able to kind of provide this kind of chain of pathways of students that had some introduction from Script Ed and then came to us, and also came to us and then to Script Ed. And I think it's an interesting conversation that pitches greatly to the kind of overall thought process of this conversation tonight, but is this concept of breadth versus depth. And are we looking to provide really, really deep experiences for a smaller amount of students, or are we looking to reach as many as possible? And in looking to reach as many as possible, how can we leverage all of these wonderful organizations across the city and really kind of efforts with curriculum or sharing teachers or partnering on a citywide events for high school students, and kind of what ways can we leverage our own strengths?
Does anyone on the panel want to comment on any of the themes under discussion? Anything you wanted to say about a different topic? Oh, what?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So I'm not sure where this fits in, but I know that, Nathaniel, you had wanted to talk about how we're changing computer science pedagogy. Like the pedagogy of 1985 or whatever is not the same. We're not asking students to build 4-function calculators anymore. That's not a good problem. And we just need to find the curriculum to support this broadening access. Personally, I just find myself looking everywhere for curriculum and finding that it's either it's not rigorous enough. It's too focused on letting students explore when I have learning goals and I have to get them to an externally graded exam, or it's just not engaging and it doesn't respect where they're coming from. There's a particular curriculum I love, and there's this textbook called Realm of Racket. I'm not sure if everybody knows it. It's like a great book. It's a great book if you're a boy. And it's a terrible book for everyone else. And I just wish it was written in a completely different voice, and it would be this wonderful book. And I just want that curriculum to exist. And I think that another repository is all of the things that we need to find to make that happen.
So I'm going to suggest that well, I think there's room to discuss curriculum actually probably in all 3 of those conversations. In fact, I think it'll probably come up in all 3 of them. So I think, thank you, Eric, for putting that back on our mind, and people will do that as they want. So, all right, now we've come to the hardest part of the evening, because each of you has to look within yourself and make a choice. We have 3 topics. Don't move anywhere yet, but make a mental decision about where you want to go while I explain what's about to happen. So we're going to split up into 3 groups. We'll probably try to spread them out a little bit more. We'll move these signs around, facilitated by our lovely panelists. In each group, we will also ask for someone's to volunteer to be presenters, who will come up at the end of the session and share what your discussion was about with the rest of us. We will also ask for someone in the group to self-select as a secretary or recorder, so that we have a record of it and the presenters have something to go off of. And we'll ask that the facilitators be a little strict about keeping time and also making sure that everyone in the group who wants to participate has the opportunity to do so. So we'll ask each of you to also keep in mind as we're talking, there's about 40 people here. We'll split into groups so you can each be able to have that conversation, but try not to monopolize the floor too much. So we're going to split into these groups. Again, the goal here is to come out of your 45 minutes of discussion with a presentation of no more than 5 minutes. I will cut you off after 5 minutes. And just share with the rest of us where you landed. And again, the key thing we're thinking about is, where have we seen success already in this arena? What are the challenges, and therefore what are the opportunities? And do you have any specific suggestions, action steps? If only someone would just, right? Those are the areas we're learning about. The facilitators have that written down on their pieces of paper so they can help with that. So with that, at this moment in time, we're going to ask you to rise up from your orange springy things and select a general corner of the room to migrate towards. I'm going to move this guy up towards me. This is better together over here. And find your group.
Member of Identified Community Education. I'm an organizer at NYC. I was volunteer for November 27th.
Each person is like, we have
District 13 is Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo across the fence.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Good job talking fast, Lyel. 1. All right. Woo! Good job, everyone. Come on back. All right. We're going to start off with team access.
So in Team Access, we talked about a ton of stuff, and I hope that I'm able to go through it all. But in the beginning, we opened up and we talked about all the success that sports has had getting women involved. Because if you think about it, 20 years ago, that was the topic, how to get girls involved in sports, and now women are in sports, and we're so happy with them. And now we're thinking, how do we get some kids in our programs, in our computer science programs? So we were thinking about trying to think of ways to follow the path of sports, but at the same time, to keep it separate, computer science, because some of the reason that a lot of our students like computer science is because it's exactly opposite of sports. So we wanted to make sure we did that. And we talked about offering a lot of different resources to students of all backgrounds, students with special needs, different cultural backgrounds, and data that was recently collected from a group of kids that are going through a program in high school through computer science. We found that students, male and female, students of different backgrounds, all wanted to keep up with computer science. They all wanted to go to major in computer science, but they didn't want to be a computer scientist. So it's really important for us to offer students many different ways that they can use their computer science background and let them know that you don't just have to have the title of computer scientist. There's so many different things that rely on computer science.
Okay. So I think that is a category more of having students aware of computer science, and how are we going to share that awareness to students and get them excited about it, relate to our students. Then we go to our teachers. A lot of teachers in our group from various schools and backgrounds. So really having, how are teachers going to find out about computer science, especially at public schools that don't have the resources, their administration doesn't know really any of these computer science software. So we basically need teacher leaders, which I know that we had in our group. We need administration to be aware of this. And some excellent points that we were talking about is really focusing on teachers that are getting trained. So teacher ed preparation programs, introducing those skills before they come into the classroom. And then also, how can we support teachers that are already in the classroom, whether if there's a technology coordinator or tech specialist in schools. But we have to support both the teachers coming into schools and those that are already there. Yeah, just sharing the excitement and the great work that this technology brings.
And we'll leave this with a quote. Somebody in our group said that we are here to teach our students to be creators of technology, not consumers of it. Thank you.
High bar. Thank you, Team Access. I think we've got an extra minute and a half. So is there anyone who is not on Team Access who wants to ask a question of Team Access? Any questions, or is that very, very sufficient? All right, great job. Second team up is going to be Alphabet Soup, who are our presenters.
Maureen.
All right, come on up.
So we discussed three big themes: challenges, successes, and we were supposed to talk about goals, but we took a baby goal and talked about assessment.
So we looked at the main challenges that we found out there in terms of getting more involvement from schools and teachers and students in computer science. We looked at it from the standpoint of computer science courses don't count towards graduation requirements, so they're not an emphasis for teachers, for schools. They don't count towards their required PD and things like that. The question out there was also raised as far as where are the qualified teachers, where's the pipeline of either, both sides were raised, the teachers who don't have programming backgrounds who are jumping in with 2 feet and trying to figure it out and feeling whether or not they're adequately prepared, but also people with technology background coming in and teaching who don't necessarily know the teaching portion of it. So we looked at it from both sides. There was some question raised about whether the tools being used were necessarily appropriate. There was some concern about Scratch, whether it was the right starting point. I know it's a very popular one, probably the most popular thing out there. And a question of whether some of the national push down of curricula from places like code.org is helping or hurting in terms of what it's doing to the teaching process, whether that's sort of crowding out some of the other ideas that have been around for 20 years about how to teach programming.
Another big challenge is like what and where are the resources for teaching computer science that you can just get involved in Google holes and not be sure where to go or who to partner with or where to get started. we talked about the core subject, right? You know, and that computer science is often thought of just as an afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, you can just do that in after school, and we'll just throw that in after school, and we'll just do that as a weekend project, where the parents can go find a place to send their children, especially at the early age. And that there doesn't seem to be any common assessment protocol in place, which, you know, can be challenging when you're trying to create your own assessments. Like, where do I go to get these resources? And that, you know, administrators are still afraid of the T word of technology in schools. But however, besides all these challenges, one of the big successes right now is the time that we're living in that there is so much accessibility. That Scratch, even though there's a lot of, at least in our group, there was a lot of debate over the viability of teaching that on the high school level, that it's free, it's accessible, and it's equitable. It's available to anybody and everybody, and there's so much in our world now that you can self-teach, even at a very young age. So that's a huge success. And then also the cost of physical computing tools and hardware is so low that you know, any family could buy a Raspberry Pi and make a ham radio project over the weekend, or Makey Makey is $50, or you know, and our Arduino is so inexpensive, and now there's an Arduino drag and drop software as well. So.
I would add to that sort of a general sense that there is a surge in awareness that's hand in hand with the surge in tools and accessible ways to go about this, but it's just a general awareness amongst schools, amongst parents, amongst politicians that this is an important thing that needs to happen as a big driver.
And then we just ended our conversation just talking about just assessment and how do we assess these computer science skills beyond the AP exam? There was a big debate that many very successful leaders in the computer science industry were actually terrible students in school and failed horribly. So, and I just brought up, like, my school in particular is big on the self-assessment model, but not every school is. So. You want to end with anything?
Well, I think as we started trying to even begin to get into the assessment question, we realized we really couldn't even start that conversation because we weren't sure what the goal was that we were trying to assess. And we are not sure that there is a common goal or that everyone has the same goal, making the idea of coming up with a framework for assessment extremely difficult. But overall, I would say cause for a lot of optimism. There's a lot of awareness, there's a lot of push, there are huge things happening, and there's a huge accessibility to new tools and new techniques, and that's, I think, creating a lot of the challenges, but also creating the way to go about it, trying to assess them.
Awesome, thank you, team two. Two very thoughtful conversations. Finally, we have the Better Together and or Divide and Conquer, or maybe that wasn't the right title after all.
So we had a really great conversation around this topic. We sort of started the topic identifying that there are several great organizations within the city that are teaching, have great programs, but the problem is, how do we create more collaboration amongst the programs, and then also to reach schools that sort of don't have this type of programming. But I'll start with some of the successes that we talked about. We mentioned the collaboration that already exists between Script Ed and Flatiron School and Teals, and how they've already created programming together that has been successful and impacted students within the schools that they've been in touch with. The wider CSNYC community, just the creation of that as a whole has sort of created an unofficial, I guess, governing body that has really brought collaboration and brought programming together. We talked about successful events such as the Hive NYC and the Teals Opportunity Fair, as well as the Queens Hackathon, which was an event that brought Queens high schools together to learn more about computer science. And lastly, we talked about Community Board 6, which was a community board in Brooklyn, that partnered with these great programs to impact the schools in their community and bring computer science to them. I think one of the things that we really talked about was finding a champion in each of the boroughs, sort of a neighborhood or community representative that have the relationships with the schools already, working with those individuals to find the different pathways into the schools, and that way we can sort of reach schools that the programs aren't touching at the moment. We identified several challenges. One of the challenges was the lack of a centralized place to find opportunities. So right now, because there's sort of all these organizations where there's not a, I guess, clear-cut way that everyone is collaborating together. And therefore, it's making it difficult for sort of the students in the schools to discover different opportunities that are available to them, that are actually out there, they just don't know how to access them. We also talked about the lack of a centralized place to find volunteer opportunities for folks who are already in the tech community, whether they're, they come from a computer science background or they work, at a tech company. How do we reach those or market the programs to those individuals and get them to come to the schools to volunteer with the students? And also the impact of measuring students and actually just finding out sort of how many there are and reducing the overlap that exists between the different programs, because some programs might work with the same students, but there's not the challenge is finding out how many of those students are actually out there and reducing the overlap. So out of the successes and challenges, there's several opportunities and to-dos. One is to sort of create a database of volunteers. Another would be to create, sort of build off of the successful Queens Hackathon and create a citywide hackathon or similar events where we bring schools that are involved with these different programs and bring them together for one unified event. Also, we talked about identifying industries within the city that have already solved this type of problem. So we spoke a lot about the arts community. There's so many great arts organizations, and they've sort of figured out a way to collaborate together so there is no overlap. So how do we sort of model the computer science education space to mimic those successful industries that have done this already? Creating a directory of programs. So this could be in collaboration with CSNYC, but creating a directory that we could pass out to members in the community, to different schools, to say, hey, this is a centralized directory where you can find all the different things that are going on in the city, whatever borough you're located in, but just creating that, unification. And also, we talked about delegating tasks to CSNYC, and basically, I know that kind of sounds bad, it's not necessarily giving work away per se, but it's really about finding the capacity constraints that exist within the existing programs and sort of finding where there is capacity to create a wider community to teach computer science in schools. So that was us. Thank you.
All right. Right on schedule. I love it. And I think we accomplished something in terms of having these great conversations. These are obviously a starting point. The good news is there is an organization whose job it is to think about some of these things, and then all of these other organizations that are part of that community. So we've actually captured all of those presentations in written form as well as in video and audio form, and hopefully we'll take some of those ideas and do something exciting with them. Of course, we need to thank once more our generous hosts here at the Flatiron School. And Tanner for taking notes. And help us clean up by eating a little bit more food, talk with each other. Technically, the event doesn't end for 15 minutes, so you're obligated to stay here and meet new people. And thank you all for being here and participating. Have a great night.